Welcome to The Explainer. Let's talk about the Old Testament. For billions of people, it's a foundational text, right? But its origins, well, they're not nearly as simple as you might think. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the secret history of how this ancient library was debated, assembled, and miraculously preserved over millennia.
So let me ask you something. When you think of the Old Testament, what comes to mind? Is it, a single massive book written from cover to cover? The reality? Oh man, it's so much more complex and honestly, way more interesting.
Okay, so here's the first big surprise. It wasn't written as a single book. A much better way to think about it is as a library, a whole library full of different kinds of writings. Histories, laws, prophecies, and poetry, all gathered together over many, many centuries.
All right, so if it's a library, that brings up a pretty big question, doesn't it? Who got to be the librarian? Who decided which books actually made it onto the official shelf? And answering that leads us to this really key idea for understanding so many of the world's scriptures.
And that idea is called the canon. The slide says it perfectly. Think of it like an official playlist for a religion. It's the end result of this long and sometimes heated process of deciding which texts are in and which ones are out. And here's where it gets really fascinating, because not everyone's playlist is exactly the same. Different religious traditions ended up with slightly different official lists of books. So, this difference really boils down to two main groups of books. First, you've got what are called the proto-canonical books. Think of these as the core collection, what makes up the Hebrew Bible. But then, there's this second group, the deuterocanonical books. These were also super popular and were eventually included in the official playlist for Catholic and Orthodox traditions.
And this is just a perfect example of how one single project could change everything. See, the Latin Vulgate, this massive translation effort, went ahead and included those extra texts. And because the Vulgate became the Bible for Western Europe for like 1,000 years, it totally cemented their place in the library for millions upon millions of people.
Okay, so we've got the what. We know which books were chosen. But that just opens up another, maybe even bigger question. How on earth did these ancient texts even survive? I mean, we're talking about an age with no printing presses, no digital backups. You really have to wrap your head around this. No printing presses, no photocopiers, no save as button. For more than 1,000 years, every single copy had to be made by hand. I mean, can you imagine? Letter by letter, word by word. It's just an incredible feat of dedication. So how do we know what the early versions looked like? Well, our best evidence comes from the earliest, nearly complete manuscripts we've ever found. Let's meet these star witnesses. They're called the Great Uncials, which is just a fancy name for the formal all-cap scripts they were written in. First up, we have the Codex Vaticanus. This thing dates all the way back to the early 4th century. It's one of the absolute oldest and most valuable windows we have into what the Bible looked like almost 1,700 years ago. Just amazing.
Next, there's the Codex Sinaiticus, another giant from the 4th century. Finding this was a huge deal for scholars. It's one of the most complete early manuscripts ever discovered, giving us this almost perfect snapshot of the text from that period.
And rounding out our big three is the Codex Alexandrinus from the 5th century. What's cool about this one is that it was the first of these incredible manuscripts to really be studied by scholars in the West, so it's a huge piece of the historical puzzle.
Okay, so these Greek manuscripts are absolutely crucial. But wait a minute, they're translations. What about the original Hebrew text itself? For that part of the story, we have to turn to a whole different group of textual guardians. Honestly, the story of how the Hebrew text was preserved is just mind-blowing, and we owe a huge debt of gratitude to a group of Jewish scribes who were active between the 7th and 10th centuries. They were called the Masoretes.
And this is where their genius really shines. They didn't just copy the text. See, ancient Hebrew was written with only consonants, no vowels. So the Masoretes, they developed this incredible system of little dots and dashes for vowel points and accent marks. Why? To make sure the traditional pronunciation was preserved forever. Plus, they wrote tons of notes in the margins to stop future scribes from making mistakes. They basically put a textual lock on it.
All right, let's step back and pull all of these threads together. What does this incredible journey, from a simple scroll to a whole library to the book you can hold in your hand, what does it all mean?
Well, it's a journey that starts with a bunch of ancient scrolls written in Hebrew and Aramaic. Then it gets forged in these intense debates over which books make the cut for the official canon. It somehow survives against all odds thanks to scribes copying it by hand.
It's perfected by the absolute genius of the Masoretti, and then it gets carried all over the world through game-changing translations like the Vulgate.
So here's the main takeaway, the thing to really remember. The Old Testament that we have today, it's not some static book that just dropped out of the sky fully formed. No way. It's the product of this long, dynamic, and very, very human history of writing, arguing, copying, and preserving.
And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. Knowing the story behind the book, all the debates, the incredible discoveries, the sheer human effort it took to preserve it for thousands of years, how does that change the way you see this ancient library?